Hey, it's Luke without a darts. Today we are going to go through and build a Jupiter. This is the new version of our Jupiter tutorial because it has needed updates for quite some time. We're also going to set this up for 3S so it works with the Proton Pack, and that is going to be really fun. Though the Jupiter has been out for a while, the Proton Pack has renewed the interest. We're going to do this blue color scheme. This is actually from the end of the video, putting it back into the beginning. And this has definitely made it more popular since a 3S Jupiter is a great option for the Proton Pack. Before we get started, I want to talk about LiPo batteries. LiPo batteries can be very dangerous, and it's important that you follow these instructions, warning labels, and read the manual on your battery. Failure to do so and ignoring all of these warnings can result in a fire or damage to your blaster. Additionally, we tape this really obnoxious card with two sides containing the same information to your battery, so we want to make it really hard for you to miss. We are frequently updating and changing other things about how you assemble the blaster, so please pay attention to any printed insert that might be included with your kit. Any future updates will be on these printed instructions, and the wiring diagram is also really handy when you're building the blaster. So first we're going to go through all of the parts to make sure you've got everything. You'll want to check that your magwell has the spring-loaded detents pre-installed inside. If you're missing anything from your kit, do let us know. The front shell, there are two halves. Here is the battery door. These are your two grip halves. Your trigger, including your firing trigger, and your rev trigger. Your hop-up, there are three different styles depending on what you chose. They're all just visual options. We're going to go with this gear one today. Next is your cage. We pre-install the motors so that you can't mix up or mess up the motor orientation. This is your little pusher. This is the actual pusher that pushes the balls into the flywheels. You'll get wire, XT60 connectors, motor solder board, along with your JST connector. These two components connect together, making swapping your motor RPM later very easy. You'll have an N20 gear motor, heat shrink large, heat shrink small, worker high crush flywheels, and there are two 21 amp switches. One is the lever switch, which is for your rev trigger. The other is a button switch for your firing trigger. Then you've got your hardware, including your screws for the switches, your square nut, your cage screws, your battery door screw, and your main body screws. We'll go over the tools. You'll need a soldering iron. This is a Weller, though I've got multiple different irons that I love. You'll need solder, snips, screwdriver number 0 or number 1, and wire strippers, though you definitely don't need fancy ones like these. You'll want an X-Acto knife, glasses for soldering. Helping hands are always helpful, and you'll need some thread locker or Loctite. You may also want a heat gun, though you can get away with a soldering iron tip for heat shrink. First, we're going to start with assembly. We're going to take our magwell and front shell and put them together. We're going to want to take a single screw here and carefully thread it in. Now this is a tight screw, so you want to make sure you apply the right amount of pressure, and you want to also make sure you're using the right kind of screw so you're not stripping the screw itself. Put the second screw in the top, which is actually the bottom of the blaster. Next, we're going to grab our two switches. This one's actually a button switch, and one's a lever. So your lever switch is for your rev trigger. We're going to take the rev switch, and we're going to bend this tab slightly so it doesn't collide with this little screw hole here. You can kind of test fit that. It's held in place with two screws. Due to the nature of how this is printed, you may want to ream these two little holes just to make sure that they can accept the screw easily. So you'll want to take your two screws and put them through the two holes in the switch. These will correspond to the two holes in the grip. And we'll just get these screwed in all the way. After you've got them screwed in all the way, you're going to want to grab pliers, and we're going to bend this tab at the top slightly to make it interface better with the actual rev trigger. If you have any problems with your trigger sticking and not sliding, you'll want to take your little rev trigger, stick it in here, and just make sure it works smoothly. That looks pretty good. Next, we're going to take our firing switch and do the same thing. Again, just screwing it into the two holes, nothing fancy here. And we can grab our firing trigger, set it in place, and make sure that it fires. If you feel any sticking, you'll want to take your trigger itself and just check for any support that might be on the base of the grip, and then also check that this little tab here isn't sticking out too much. There's slight variations from printer to printer, so you'll want to make sure that this is trimmed as needed. And all you need to do is just file off a couple layers here if it's not perfectly smooth. And I got to remember which way it goes, and we'll put it back in there, and that's feeling really, really good. Next, we're going to install our square nut for the battery door, and I just grab mine with the pliers like this. It can be a little tricky if you haven't done this before, but just pinch it in place, and then you're going to push it all the way in. There's just a little slot here, and you want it to be all the way up in the slot. And after you've done that, you can grab your battery door screw and actually screw it in to just make sure that it's threading in properly. It's good to do this now rather than at the end. If you have a Proton Pack, it'll screw into this same terminal. Just keep that in mind. We also offer an optional thumb screw, but that's for the standard blaster only. Next, we're going to do our cage and put our motor screws in. It's worth noting these red dots are supposed to be alternating. Do not change them in position. We ship them that way intentionally to make sure that they are correct and not screwed up. So we're going to take one of our flywheel cage screws and our thread locker, and we just want this little dot on each screw before it goes in to hold the motors in place. You don't need too much here, really just enough that it will grip the metal inside and stop this from rotating free as it vibrates really heavily under heavy use like the Proton Pack. And repeat the same thing for the other 4 screws, or other 4 total. And you want to wipe away any excess and make sure that it's flush up at the top so that there's nothing in the way of your flywheels. Next, you're going to grab your flywheels and we're going to press these in place while supporting the back of the motors with my other hand. So you can see here I'm kind of pushing from both sides rather than just down. You can push all the way down on these. As far as you can push them in, they will stop automatically due to the flex and the spacing of the bearing on the motors. So you don't really have to worry about alignment. You can also use pliers down on a table like this to support the back of the motor, where you're not damaging the table or the motor tabs themselves. Once you're done, these should look just like this with a little bit of the shaft protruding up the top. And you want to check that these are spinning freely and nothing's in the way. This is our new little PCB. We're going to prep this by snipping the 2 tabs off on the bottom so it can sit on flush on the top of the motors. Once this is nice and flat, you're good to go, and this will eventually be soldered to the motor. But these 2 parts connect, allowing you to swap out the motor later if you ever want to change your rate of fire, since the N20 determines your actual fire rate. Now we can connect this. Don't worry about the polarity. We'll correct that with the wire, but you want to sit nice and flat, and then we are going to solder into these 2 small holes here to attach the board to the motor. Safety first. Let's put on these eye protection and grab our solder. We always use lead-free solder, and we do sell this on the shop. We're going to just solder these 2 small terminals. You want to be careful not to melt the plastic portion as well, so take your time here and solder one side, then the other. Once you're done, the motor should look like this. You want to have just 2 nice little dabs of solder on those terminals. Next, we're going to install the pusher wheel onto the N20 gear motor. It should be pretty obvious how this fits on. If it's tight and not sliding on easily, you can trim it with a knife to make sure that the inside is entering and the shaft gets in there all right. It should turn, but be very gentle with gear motors. You should never really turn gear motors because you can damage the windings. Now we're going to take our gear motor and set it inside of the cage. And it just should sit loose here. You want to make sure that this is centered. Rather than trying to figure out the motor orientation before we put this in here, we'll just switch the wires themselves to indicate positive and negative to get our rotational direction on the pusher. So what we're going to want to do is grab our battery here, and we're actually just going to shove the leads right into the connector. Be careful when you're doing this not to touch anything together, but we're going to look to make sure that we get the right direction, and you have to just visualize the balls going through there and visualize this actually pushing the balls into the flywheels rather than pushing them away from the flywheels. So indeed here we are seeing that it is actually the reverse of the coloring, so you just want to essentially mark this. It looks like black will be our positive. So I'm going to put a little knot in what is effectively going to be my negative terminal, since that's the shortest piece and the last thing that we will do. Now we're going to attach our grip to our frame. It just clips in place. Then we're going to grab our cage. And again, this is our negative, which will eventually attach to this terminal here, but that'll be the last thing we do. So we're going to take our positive, which is in our example is the black wire, and we're going to wind it all the way back here to this terminal on the top switch. I'm going to cut it, strip it, and attach it to this terminal. And I like to insert it into the actual hole. It just makes it a little easier having a positive connection there, and then I don't even have to use helping hands when soldering. And then we can go ahead and solder that in place. We're going to lift up the cage, and we're going to take our red wire and fish it all the way back through for our battery connector later through this hole. And leave just enough for an XT60 connector there, and then we're going to put the red and black wire back through this channel here. The red wire will hold the black wire underneath it, and you can use a screwdriver to just poke these into the wire channels, which should retain them just fine. They are designed exactly for the wire gauge we have. Same thing with these channels here. You can use a small screwdriver to poke down the wire, and the channels will hold the wire there specifically. And then we'll place our cage back on the blaster. Then we can continue routing this wire down to the bottom, and we're going to attach it to that terminal there, the one we did not bend. So we're going to cut and strip that just like before. And we'll solder that to that same terminal. Again, I like to just sort of partially stick this through there. It gives that physical connection and makes it much easier to do without helping hands. And make sure that you don't have any stray wires sticking out there. And we'll solder in place. Now we are going to start with the red wire. I like to use a Sharpie to mark the two terminals. We're going to connect this one here, and then we will strip the end. But basically we're going to strip midstream here, so we kind of marked that battery terminal, motor terminal, excuse me, and then we will strip the end, and then those two will line up perfectly with where we want to solder them. Now for here, you're definitely going to want some helping hands, or a friend, or maybe you have 3 hands. I frequently wish I did. And I like to wrap this around this terminal and down through this wire trap channel there. Now we're going to solder to these 2 terminals. It's important when you're soldering to any motor terminal to not have any excess solder touching the motor housing or the can itself, because that can cause a potential short. And it looks like I still could use a little bit more solder here, so I'm just going to make sure that's a good, nice, clean connection. Now we're going to route that wire down the same path that the other wire followed. And you are going to want to put this nice and flush down on top. We're going to go down 1 wire channel, wire trap up top, then up, and again tuck these in, just like we did with the previous wire. You can attempt to shove this in here, though it can actually sit on top of the switch as well. I'm forgetting that as I was doing this because it had been a while since I had built one. We're going to loop this back around, and it's going to connect to this other terminal on the base switch. So we'll go ahead and kind of measure, bend, and mark that to get our connection. We're going to strip this in line here because this wire will continue up to our firing switch, and that prevents the firing switch from running when the rev switch hasn't been activated, which can prevent jams. So we'll solder this down to the second terminal here. Always refer to the diagram if you're ever confused about where the wires are going, but hopefully we've done a good enough job here in this new video format to make this obvious. So this is being soldered in line, and this same wire will continue up to our other switch. Now we will strip and cut and solder to the bottom right terminal on this top firing switch. It's worth noting that there is plenty of room inside this shell when the other side is on, so you don't have to worry about how high these wires sit when they are in here. And so we'll solder to this terminal. We want to make sure that we don't have wire touching these 2 terminals together. Next, we're going to take our black wire and fish it down through the same hole that we sent the red wire through. Again, bring this out as long as we want for our XT60 connector. Then we're going to tuck this wire underneath these little tabs here, they hold it down and away from the flywheels. It's important that you don't get wires in your flywheels. Follow up through this channel, and then down and around through the second wire trap on the bottom right there. You want to make sure you have plenty of slack there to get down to this switch. We're going to go through a new channel on the bottom. It's not totally necessary, but I like to use a Sharpie again to mark my terminals so I know where to strip this wire in line. I like not breaking the wire as much as possible. And then we're going to go ahead and strip both those two markings. And then we'll kind of widen that a little bit to get it on top of the motor terminals. Now I'm actually kind of straddling the wire terminals by shoving the wire terminals through the wire. This holds on a little more solidly, so I'm kind of using my snips here just to separate. So essentially make a tiny little hole and shove the wire terminal through that hole. It's not totally necessary, but it does make it hold on easier, and it makes soldering considerably easier, I think, because you don't have to mess with the helping hands quite as much. We did design this cage to be able to solder it without using helping hands, just to make assembly a little bit easier. I might end up grabbing a helping hands just to hold this down a little bit, push a little positive pressure, but you can do whatever you prefer and whatever seems easier. So we'll solder that top terminal, and then we'll get the bottom one as well. It's actually been a long time since I've made one of these, so it's kind of fun to do this. I've built hundreds of them, but it's been a few years because we just have not had the time with the growing business. And there you can see we want to do a quick inspection to make sure that there's no solder touching the cans on all 4 terminals. This is really, really important. It's probably the #1 Nerf modding electric issue that we see is just too much solder, and you really don't need too much solder, that much solder. You just need enough to make the contacts solid. Great, now we will take that black wire through that bottom wire trap and make sure we shove enough in there to get down the channel. You do want to make sure this sits nice and flush down in here so that the 2 shells will close fine. Then after we kind of maneuver that, we'll follow this bottom channel all the way back to the firing switch. We're going to take this black wire now and run it to the first terminal on the firing switch. It's important to check the trigger again to make sure that it actually is free. We're going to kind of do a little up and down, so the wire needs to actually come up towards you and back down, and you want to make sure that your trigger isn't receiving any interference there. If you have any interference issues, you can hot glue right where my finger is there. So figure out your length. Again, we're going to cut, strip, and solder to the terminal. Strip. This is probably the only tricky wiring in the whole thing, just because of where this wire runs. You really want to double check that this isn't impeding your triggers, either the top or the rev trigger, so firing and rev. But again, you're kind of going up and then back down to the switch. It's sort of like a little loop. I find it helpful to use helping hands here. Every time I say it's helpful to use helping hands, I kind of laugh. But you can see how I've kind of got it attached here, where it goes up and then down to the switch, so it avoids both triggers. And we'll go ahead and solder that in place. So before we close this up, you do want to check that both your switches and triggers are smooth. I like to put a little bit of super lube on the back of this switch. It's not 100% necessary, but it can make your trigger a little bit smoother with how we've crammed everything inside this grip. And that should be nice and clean, clicky. Just make sure that there's nothing impeding it and there's no sticking. If you do have any issues, you'll just want to take a X-Acto knife and trim away any bits that are impeding the movement. And same with the top, just make sure that that is nice and smooth. And you can add a little bit of lubricant to the top and the bottom just to make sure it's extra smooth. You really don't need to use too much. Lastly, we're going to take our negative lead, which was the one we put a little knot in, and we're going to connect that to the negative. We're going to splice this right into the negative top terminal of the motor, but we do need to run it down under that same wire guide so it's not touching the flywheels and potentially ruining the wire itself. And you can use a screwdriver to just push that down in place. Same as before, I'm going to line this up and mark it with a Sharpie. You could just cut it if you prefer to do that, but I like measuring once and marking and then cutting and doing it that way, just to make sure I always get the right lengths that I actually want. And we'll go ahead and cut, strip, and then solder that on. Those auto stripping wire strippers are super handy. I am going to use a helping hands here again to follow this same path and set this in because the wire channel won't hold this light gauge of wire. It's important when you're soldering over the top here that you don't ruin the previous solder joint, but you definitely want to melt it enough that the whole thing fluxes so that it actually connects and is a rock solid connection. And again, you want to make sure that these wires go all the way down under and they are not touching your flywheels in any way. Now we are ready to do our XT60 connector. You'll want to determine what length you want. I like about 1.5 inches, 2 inches, maybe 60 millimeters or something. It's kind of personal preference, but you need enough room to actually bend the connector back around. And we'll strip, add some heat shrink, and of course solder on our XT60 connector. I like to take the two pieces and use both because if you use the second half while you're soldering, it helps hold for deforming, especially if you've got a cheaper soldering iron, it's a little easier. Then we're going to slide these heat shrink pieces on here. These are the small heat shrink. And just get those out of our way. I'm going to start with the negative here, which is the curved side of the XT60 connector. Flat is always positive. The angled or curved side is always negative. I prefer not to pre-tin these when I'm installing. I just like to flux the solder until I have filled up the entire cup. And then we're going to switch over and do the positive side. Again, the positive is always the flat side. And we can pull our pieces of heat shrink back up and we will heat gun those in place. You can also use your soldering iron or a lighter or whatever you choose. Lastly, I'm going to do a little overcovering with this larger piece of heat shrink. What I'll do is I'll take a pliers and I'll just stretch this slightly. This is not, of course, necessary, but I think it kind of has a nice look when it's all said and done. So we're just going to kind of slide that on. It gives a little more strain relief, and it just has a nice look overall. Now we're ready to close up the blaster. So we will start by putting our hop-up gear in the front. I like the gear. I think it has kind of a cool look. If you find that this is playing more than you want, you can put a small piece of tape or a small dab of hot glue here. We've left this loose enough so that the shell closes easily, but wanted it to be rotatable in case people want to play with their hop-up. And we're going to set the shell in place first, and we're going to make sure that all the seams close fine and that there's nothing else in our way like wire or some piece of plastic or anything like that. Yeah, better put that guy back in there. Then we got 4 screws. These are the smallest screws that are included in the kit, and we'll want to screw those all down. These are just toy screws, so keep that in mind. You don't need to over-tighten them. Next, we're going to take our grip. Same thing. We're going to click that down in place. I've got this wire running in kind of in the wrong spot. It actually needs to run up, above, and over the switch. There, again, is plenty of room there, so it shouldn't impede with anything. So we'll snap that down in place. And then you want to check both your triggers. Make sure they're still functioning right before you actually put all the screws in. That'll save some time. They should both be nice and clicky. They should be nice and loose, and nothing should be sticking or impeding you from firing. If not, again, there's just little bits of trimming you can do with an X-Acto knife. Then we'll put our 5 screws in and screw the rest of the blaster up. I do not recommend using a power tool here, even a small driver. Use your hands because these are just simple toy screws and they are going into plastic, of course, like a normal Nerf blaster. And lastly, we are going to take our battery door screw out and we are going to actually test our blaster. Always going to want to use a LiPo alarm. Again, with LiPo batteries, please read the instructions. It's worth noting it doesn't matter if you put it backwards, it just won't work, but make sure that it beeps when you first put it in. And now we're going to test it. And we're sounding good. We'll grab a magazine here for this example, and we'll make sure it fires. Oh, that was fun. And there we have it. That is completed. Now, I'm not going to put this battery in because this is destined to go with my Proton Pack. I've got the 12 round a second motor in here, which shoots 18 rounds a second with the Proton Pack, and so this will eventually connect directly to that rather than to the normal battery door. But if you do want to do your normal battery door, you would just put the battery door in and screw your screw in. Pretty simple. And again, we do offer an optional thumb screw on the shop. It's listed on the listing. And searchable on the site, of course, as well. And then we'll put this screw in. This is a 2.5 millimeter hex screw. We use the same for everything on the entire shop. And there you have it, a finalized Jupiter with our newest tutorial. I think this is still a really, really fun blaster, especially with the Proton Pack. We love making these tutorial videos, but they do take a substantial amount of time, so I really appreciate it if you hit that like and do subscribe. We'll have a lot more coming in the future. I am really excited for 2021 and 2022. Until next time, I'm out of darts.